Joining us this afternoon. Excuse me about that. Thank you again for tuning in today's program. This afternoon, the Antiquities lecture will celebrate the TMA's formal acquisition of Patricia Cronin's beautiful sculpture, Aphrodite Reimagined. We will talk with her and my predecessor, Seth Pevnick, about the creation and inspiration behind the sculpture, the related exhibition in the TMA in 2018, as well as the relevance of ancient art for our contemporary society. But before I begin, I would first of all like to thank Bill Zawadzki for his enduring support for this program and many others at the museum. Always much appreciated, Bill. Also, for anyone attending, you can use all the functionality. Like Brittany said, if you have a quick question during our conversation, then please feel free to raise your hand or to ask a question in the chat. Your input is always very much appreciated. Patricia, if you would turn on your camera and unmute your microphone.
Hi, Branko. How are you?
Hi, Patricia. How are you today?
I'm great. It's so good to see you.
Excellent. Yeah, likewise. Same here. So thank you for joining our conversation today. As many of you may very well know, Patricia Cronin is a Brooklyn-based artist and Brooklyn College professor of art, as well as a human rights and social justice activist. She has studied at Brooklyn College, Rhode Island College, and Yale University, among others. Patricia has exhibited her Shrine for Girls in New York, Dublin, at the Venice Biennale, and has had other recent solo exhibitions at the Armory in New York, the Capitoline Museums in Rome, and the Newcomb Art Museum in New Orleans, to name just a few. She has also produced the catalogue raisonné of the works of American sculptor Harriet Hosmer. But Patricia Cronin is probably best known for her critically acclaimed Memorial to a Marriage, installed since 2002 on a personal burial mark in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, before same-sex marriage was legalized in New York State in 2011. The sculpture shows the artist and her life partner, by now wife artist Deborah Cass, in an eternal embrace. The work very poignantly underscores the experience of all same-sex couples whose relationship was not recognized by law except in death, that is, through last wills and testaments. Let us now welcome Seth Pevnick too. If you could unmute your mic, Seth, and turn on your camera so we can all see you. Hi, Seth.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us. As everyone, of course, knows, Seth was the Richard E. Perry Curator of Greek and Roman Art at the Tampa Museum of Art for 10 years, from 2009 through 19, as well as Chief Curator from 2013 onward, and briefly also Acting Director from 2014 to 15. In March 2019, he joined the Cleveland Museum of Art as their curator of Greek and Roman art. While he was at Tampa, he curated exhibitions such as Poseidon and the Sea in 2014, Animals in Ancient Art in 2016, and of course, Aphrodite and the Lure of Antiquity in 2018. The reason why he joins our conversation today. So Seth, if I may, how did this project come into existence?
Well, it started as a conversation with the collection, as we say, but also a conversation that I had with Joanna Robotham, the curator of modern and contemporary art in Tampa. And we were sort of brainstorming about ways to make a connection between the ancient art collection in Tampa and the rest of the collection, which can sometimes be a bit of a challenge, right? At many museums that display ancient art, they also display art from all different time periods and allow this sort of chronological connection. And in Tampa, we have a big gap And so we started brainstorming about contemporary artists working today whose work somehow engaged with the art and the culture of the ancient Mediterranean world. And Patricia Cronin was one of those artists, and thankfully she was interested in joining us in this project.
No, that's terrific. Patricia, what was your initial interest in this project?
Well, for an artist like me that really looks back constantly at art history, Seth's phone call, just even to talk about this, was such a welcome call. It was kind of like a dream proposition to ask a contemporary artist that already works in the forms of neoclassicism with Memorial to a Marriage, which people just saw that you showed. I was like, this would be fantastic to go back even further in time to their inspiration, which would be the ancient Greco-Roman world. And so I was absolutely thrilled. I mean, I couldn't imagine, a more thought-provoking and provocative, artistic and intellectual invitation, frankly.
So that's fantastic. So did you first come to the TMA to visit the museum, or did you immediately have something in mind? Did you immediately think about Aphrodite, or were you first like, Poseidon might be nice? How did that work?
Well, the genius of this conversations with the collection is that there are 2 visits down to the site, to the museum, where you meet with the curator, you look at the entire collection, what's on view, but also what's in storage. And so we got to look at ancient glass and all the amazing vase paintings. I mean, paintings on vases, but also the Etruscan cinerary urns. I mean, it was just such a rich collection. So for a contemporary artist like me, it was like being in a kid in a candy shop. It was really thrilling. But the first moment that Seth and I walked into the Art of the Ancient World was the permanent collection version of that part of the collection that was up. I was just bowled over. Aphrodite was one of the first things I saw. And at that time, the United States was becoming a little bit more I'd say just like hostile towards women. And I looked at her and I thought, she was an authority in the ancient world, one of the 12 Olympiads. I know I can do something. I'd like to try to do something with her. So I was just thrilled. But I had no idea until I got there that that would be what I worked on. And another thing is, the other part of this conversations with the collection, it involved a commissioned artwork of how the artist responds to the collection, but also 2 trips for the curator to come up to visit with me, and Seth can talk more about that. But those 4 visits really, it gave, I think, an unusually greater depth for a project like this that artists don't normally. Opportunities like this are very, very rare, and it was so special. And we got to, well, Seth can take it from here. Some of the things we did.
What are some of your memories, Seth?
Yeah, I think I would add that it was special for me too. Of course, I've spent most of my career working on ancient art, and of course, by definition, that means I can't get to know the artists the way that you can with a contemporary artist. And so it was really fun and exciting for me to fly up to New York. And on my first visit, Patty took me to see Memorial to a Marriage. And there are several versions, right? So we saw the one in the cemetery at Woodlawn Cemetery, but we also went upstate to see the marble version, which is not on view in the cemetery to maintain its pristine state. And so that was really powerful for me to see those in situ and with Patty to understand them from her perspective. And we also had a great time on one of our visits going down to Princeton, where there was a major exhibition on the Berlin painter, one of the leading red figure artists of his time, the early 5th century BC. Of course, as a vase painting scholar, I had been sort of secretly hoping that Patty would do something related to vases, although of course it worked out perfectly with the Aphrodite. But I think that was another chance for us to spend time together, but also to to get to see other curators and other scholars, because there was not only was that big exhibition on view, but there was a symposium. And so she was able to speak with other scholars, and we were able to talk about our project together. And of course, that wasn't new for Patty, right? She has spent a lot of time at the American Academy in Rome, where artists and scholars are constantly conversing with one another. And I think all of this back and forth was really a positive development. And I don't think that this would have succeeded as nicely as it did if we hadn't had all those visits.
Yeah, I completely agree. And even that the Aphrodite commissioned monumental sculpture and even the paintings, one is behind me, they never would have been the right size had I not been off, had not 2 visits to the Tampa Museum been part of the whole project. No artist could have gotten it right unless you can make your models out of styrofoam and everything, but it's not the same as actually being in the physical space. It was really important.
Yeah, I fully understand. So research went behind it, and then you make this decision, like, okay, so it really is Aphrodite that has caught my my interest or caught my eye. Explain to me and to all of us, did you let your imagination run free, or did you go into the iconography of Aphrodite and Venus portrayals? How did that go?
I absolutely had to do research because I take, this is an important invitation. It's a museum and a commission and a solo show and a catalog. You can't just be a contemporary artist who goes, oh, I'll do what I think Aphrodite is and get it all wrong. So no, I had to be very, very serious, but it's also my nature. I love all the research that goes into making my different bodies of work. So it was really just intellectually so stimulating to be able to go back and research all the different kinds of Aphrodites. And yes, the one I was working from, she's not a crouching Aphrodite. She's not an Aphrodite pudica, totally nude, gesturing towards her chest and pubic area, she's not a Venus Victrix, you know what I mean? So we're just trying to figure out, what was this one? And they had, in the object file, and Seth had some really great discoveries there. They had 19th century photographs of really very wrong restorations from the 17th and 18th century with the wrong head. And all different ideas that she was holding a bow and arrow. And because of all these different realities, that started getting in my head about what I could do for all of her missing parts.
Mm-hmm. So in that creative process, I imagine you saw images such as these. How then did you settle on that pose?
Well, I had to use, not had to, I wanted to use the torso that existed.
Of course,
and
that
Seth,
guides you.
yes, and Seth had that 3D scanned and we printed it here, but I started to think about, well, what should the gesture be? And the photograph, I know you've seen some of them, there is her arm reaching up to be one of the Aphrodites that is pulling a cloak over or releasing a cloak and letting it go. We never know if she's stepping into the bath or out of the bath, but I just liked that gesture. And so that's where I guess the left arm comes from. And the right arm, because previously in one of the restorations, it was extended slightly. I thought I wanted to stay somewhat historically accurate, but just do my version of things. But I couldn't have her with a bow and arrow for sure. That's Eros.
No, exactly. So Seth, maybe you can give a bit of a background for all the art historians in here, the different Venuses and Aphrodites. Of course, they all lose their arms because marble breaks right exactly there. But some of the illustrations that you see here, for instance.
Sure. As you say, these have all been reconstructed to various extents, and that speaks to the history of collecting, right? That all of these objects were buried for centuries, and when they were discovered in the 17 or 1800s, the desire from most collectors was not to have an incomplete statue, but to have a complete one. And there wasn't this concern about whether the complete nature was all ancient or if it involved some modern restorations. And so that's what we see here. But then in the center, the Venus de Milo at the Louvre, we see without the restorations, of course, and that's the way that we prefer it today. We want to see only what is ancient and not these more recent interventions.
Here you have an example where our actual Venus torso is standing. It's a little hard to see, but all the way on the right, you see her standing between Cupid and Paris. And all the sculptures that you see here are fully restored. Did you make some more discoveries about that, Seth, during this process?
Yeah, I did, and that was super exciting for me. I think maybe the person who was next most excited was Patty. But we've now shared this discovery with a number of people, and the Tampa Aphrodite, of course, came to Tampa in 1986 as part of the Joseph Veitch Noble collection. And Mr. Noble had acquired it in the 1950s, and he had traced it back to Marbury Hall, which is what we see here, an important English collection, where it arrived probably in the late 1700s and stayed for well over a century. When that collection was dispersed, there was a bit of a blank spot in our chain of ownership, and we weren't sure exactly what happened. And of course, in this image, which was already known, you see her with a head and with her arms and her legs, right? Much more complete than she looks today. And the question, of course, was, well, what happened to all those pieces? Exactly. And I still don't know the answer to all of those pieces, but by chasing down some more of the early publications, and also thanks to the digitization of the records of an important dealer, Joseph Brummer, who was working in New York for many decades in the early 20th century, we know that he acquired the sculpture probably as it looks in this image and recognized, as others had earlier, that the head was ancient but didn't belong with the torso in antiquity. And that's not uncommon, right? As I mentioned, in the 17 and 1800s, when people wanted things to be complete, they didn't really care if that complete version was accurate as it had been in antiquity.
Exactly. So where did the head end up?
So the head ended up with a collector in Santa Barbara, California, right as Ludington. And I recognized that name on the catalog card from Mr. Brummer. And I reached out to colleagues in Santa Barbara, and they said, yes, indeed, it is here. So he had eventually donated it to the Santa Barbara collection, and thankfully they consented to our request to borrow it for the show. And we didn't put them back together, of course, but we showed them side by side in Tampa. And I think that was an interesting way to illustrate some of this long biography, as it were, of the Tampa Aphrodite.
Oh, exactly, it's like a second life that sculpture has. So then comes the creative process, Patricia. I'm sure that the audience would love to hear more about all the thoughts and ideas that went behind your design.
Well, picking up on what Seth was just saying about how they used to like a very complete reconstruction, I wanted it to be visible and legible to any viewer that walked in the gallery that obviously this is not a complete, ancient statue, that a contemporary artist has done an intervention in some way. And so I used, late 20th and early 21st century materials, resin, for those translucent parts. And it coalesces with different parts of all the different kinds of Aphrodites. But what you're looking at here in this image is really interesting because I don't know if you can see that pink little torso off to the right-hand side of the screen. That's the 3D printout of the Tampa Museum torso of Aphrodite. And I used that in my studio to then add clay to. it's a little bit of a long process, but then once I sculpted all the clay parts, actually, perhaps the next slide might even be better, Branko. I just realized that. Yes. All right, now it's the hot pink fuchsia plastic resin that you're seeing. That was 3D printed. And then you're seeing my hand sculpting of all the different missing parts. And what happened, the head is down on the lower left-hand corner. You can see the Santa Barbara head that I've got Xeroxed and up there. Yeah, exactly. And so Marbury Hall is above where her head should be. And I'm really looking at all of these source materials and trying to figure out what should my reimagined Aphrodite look like, the hand sculpted parts. So I'm using ancient technology, hand modeling in clay, and I'm using 21st century technology, the 3D print, scanning and printing to then make this, Aphrodite, goddess of Nixus, coalescing all of these different, technologies, formal, innovations, across centuries and obviously geographies. What happens once she's all one whole clay and resin body is we make a mold and we pour what we pour a plaster, and that's on the right-hand side of your screen. And I don't know if you can see, there are pencil marks and they're little tiny little X's, and it's called the pointing system. And it's from ancient to, I guess, 21st century, because we still use it. And this is how you point up from the maquette, which you can see behind me is just this size, to the monumental 10-foot version. And so just trying to describe the different steps. When we point up to the new full clay version, if you could go back just to the previous slide. I'm sorry, I should have realized these were in a different order.
Don't worry about it.
Then you can see the 10-foot version, but she's in two different parts. So I've still got the 3D printed torso. I've got the plaster, maquette size ones. And now I'm refining all the clay and trying to make sure in its 10-foot version that when we put her all together, this will look good. It's stressful isn't even the right word, because the stakes were high and I really wanted to get this right. And but I think artists from every time period use all of the technology that's available to them. So whether I'm still using the most traditional skills of modeling in clay, or I'm using 21st century digital technology, I think all of it was necessary, to make this now and have it still look new and old, ancient and 21st century.
Patty, I'm also reminded as I look at these images of our conversations going back and forth about the dimensions of the doorways to get out onto the sculpture terrace, right? We knew that in a single piece, there was no way that it would fit out there. And so there was a lot of running back and forth on both ends to make sure that it would fit. And thank goodness it did.
It did.
And
this might also be a good moment to point out that our colleague at USF, Davide Tedassi, helped out with this project IDEX to scan and print out the Venus torso. And that your sculpture was originally intended remain on the terrace at the TMA. But in addition to this, there are a few more impressions. You see the small and the big size, and all over your studio, there are different versions and different stages. And what's happening on the right?
okay, so this is great, because then the viewers really get to see the scale of the clay that I'm working on. It's absolutely necessary to then really work on every square inch of the clay. And it's not just about getting it smooth, but in proportion, that all the parts, even though I'm working from the waist down on one part, from the waist up on another part, and the head on another, but everything has to coalesce and work together. The middle one is just in the studio. You're looking at, maquette size versions of her, some feet, because I wanted to make sure the feet were really good. And then on the right-hand side, we then, once I get my full-size clay, we still have to make yet another mold. And then we're pouring resin for my hand sculpted parts. And then we poured a cold cast marble, which is marble dust and epoxy for the ancient torso. And we're starting to put her together to make sure, you know, it all looks good before then it's crated up and shipped to the museum. And so we're using a gantry and a hoist, and because these things weigh a ton. You need lots of people, machinery, you know, no individual artist can make anything monumental alone. It's impossible.
Yeah, it's amazing to see all this. And then, of course, it wasn't just a sculpture that you were going to create.
It's true. In January of 2018, now the show opens August of 2018. January of 2018, I went to the American Academy in Rome because I knew that Rome had this heavy concentration of Aphrodite sculptures, supposedly inspired, you know, and the best, closest renditions to Praxiteles' Aphrodite, 350 BC, you know, one of the most important sculptures in the ancient world. And I wanted to go around to every museum and double check my work on my maquette, make sure what I was doing was right. And I went to what they say is the closest, which is the Palazzo Altemps in Rome. And there was a little didactic wall label that had all the parts that were restored versus the part that was original. And something about this image and looking at that and the Ludovisi Aphrodite, it just really struck my imagination. I thought, oh, I could do some paintings on this, something about it. And so when I came back, instead of making little small sketches that I normally do before I do a monumental painting, I just couldn't wait. I was just so inspired. And since Aphrodite is born of the sea, meaning water, I knew it couldn't be oil paint. I've never painted with acrylic before, so I don't know any of the rules. So I put plastic down, put canvas down. On the left-hand side, you're seeing just the canvas of the Aphrodite Capua that's in the museum in Napoli, Archaeological Museum. And I just started painting. And all this paint started seeping through. And when I took the canvas up and hung it on the wall, this residue that was left over was really beautiful. And that's when I decided to start making these layers, just like in the fractured, translucent versus opaque versions of the sculpture. I started doing translucent panels, like not veils, but almost like sheets of thought or memory, like you can't get to the real statue. Anyway, it kept working and I kept doing them. So you can see in the center, you can see the one that's behind me from the Vatican Museum, the Colonna, Venus, the Capua is in the middle, and the other one's from Turkey. And I just kept making them. And because I'm in Brooklyn and I have a little beach place on Long Island, and the Tampa Museum was inviting me to do this, we're both really worried about hurricanes. Hurricane season is a big deal. We use blue plastic tarps a lot to protect what we value. And I just thought something about the sea, they look like sails on ships, and Aphrodite's connection to water is so strong, and being a protector of maritime, as well as love and beauty and regeneration. So that's when this new assemblage type painting started coming into fruition. And it was just another, I think of this invitation from the Tampa Museum as the gift that keeps on giving, because there's so much more for me to keep, excavating, frankly.
Terrific. By the way, I want that maquette. It's terrific. It is amazing, but the maquette is really wonderful. Brittany, could you read out the question that I think is in the chat?
Yes, it's a comment that from Dr. Bob Bianchi that in antiquity there were numerous versions of Aphrodite. So the version being discussed during this program is well within an established ancient tradition, namely constantly reinventing and reimagining an image of a very popular goddess.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. And that leads us to this. Why a pomegranate?
The pomegranate. Well, in the ancient world, I thought it was for eternal life, beauty, and regeneration. Fertility, am I wrong? Let's see. Let me check my notes. Yes, fertility, beauty, and eternal life.
This is not saying that it is wrong at all. Maybe Seth, you can chime in.
Yeah, I think those are all absolutely true. I think maybe the most famous mentions of the pomegranate have to do with Persephone, who is the daughter of Demeter, right? And is abducted by Hades and taken down to the underworld, and she doesn't want to stay there. And Hermes intervenes to try to bring her back. But Hades has gotten her to eat some pomegranate seeds. And because she has eaten of the pomegranate seed in the underworld, the resolution is that she will have to go back and forth, right? She can leave, but she'll always have to return. And for that reason, I think there is this connection to death and to regeneration. We see pomegranates, for example, in the Tampa Museum. There's a lovely geometric ceramic vase in the shape of a pomegranate, all the way from the 8th century BC. And these types of vases, when they're found archaeologically, are often found in the tombs of children. And so there is this idea that perhaps they are connected to death, but also to eternal youth and to being reborn.
The only other god who comes back from the dead, Adonis, his blood is compared to the color of the pomegranate. So there's another connection of that symbolism of death and dying and being allowed to return from the death. And then it is said that Aphrodite planted the first pomegranate tree on Cyprus. But of course, many Aphrodite sculptures are now reconstructed with what they think is the apple of the Judgment of Paris. So I think that by adding this fruit to the hand of Aphrodite, you have beautifully given your own interpretation to, like Dr. Bob said, an already existing repertoire of different poses and variations, and you give it your own symbolism of mystery, sexuality, death, fertility, and so on. Brittany, I think there was another question that just came in, or a comment in the chat.
There was a question. Barbara Stubbs asks, is the connection between the marble and the resin permanent, or is it to be separated ever?
Oh, I don't think they should be separated. I think it should all stay together. If they need to, I'm trying to think. If it needs to be moved, there are sections that do come apart and then can be put back together. But it is one complete, contemporary statue. Yeah, in one part.
So this statue also leads to the issue of, in this case, Aphrodite's near nudity, but also the idealization of female beauty. And Patricia, you mentioned this in the beginning, the objectification of women's bodies. What are your thoughts about this while you were working in this process? Maybe these kinds of thoughts came and played a part in slightly veiling the paintings?
I've got lots of thoughts about it. Well, so first of all, I'd like to separate the two terms, idealized and objectification, just for a second, because the ancient Greek statues of male gods were also idealized, right? The Poseidon at the Tampa Museum, also idealized, and that stressed their power and their beauty. And I think the same is true of Aphrodite. I think, in fact, we can say that Praxiteles was equating the status and power of the heroic male nude with the first monumental statue of Aphrodite with her powers. And so I really believe that wholeheartedly. And then if we turn to, objectifying or objectification, there's a prurient intent in that, right? There's a subjugation. And it implies no agency. It implies no choice with the nudity, but Aphrodite is not a victim and she's not property. And I see, especially in the ancient, I'm going to say, in the ancient world, most of the statues, I mean, maybe I can think of one, but really I see naturalism. I see mathematical proportions, right? There aren't over large breasts or buttocks or, I don't know, or hips, right? So it's really, it is idealized. It's not, I don't want to say grotesque, but it's not exaggerated. The heroic pose or proportions, demonstrating her specific attributes and gifts and what she had power over. And because of the strong association with water, this protector of maritime concerns, regeneration, a bath, whether she was stepping into or out of the bath, was always shown because that's where her power was. And I see nudity as her natural state. And I actually see nudity as all of our natural state. So, I just don't see the prurient objectification that seems any different than how the male gods were treated during this time period. But I'm limiting it to the ancient world because that's what we're talking about today.
Seth, Patricia mentioned Praxiteles, and perhaps you can add a little bit of background. Why is he so important?
Sure. Praxiteles, of course, is one of the most famous sculptors of the ancient world. Lived and worked primarily in Athens in the 4th century BC. And although he's famous for having made quite a lot of different statues, and particularly statues in bronze, one of his marble statues, the one that we're talking about, the Aphrodite of Knidos, was by far his most famous. And the reason for that is because it was the first large-scale female nude, at least the first that we know about. Up to that point, there had been many, many sculptures of male nudes, right, for centuries before. Think of a kouros, for example, in the Archaic period. But the female equivalent of the kouros, the kore, is always draped. And scholars have debated for a long time what the reasons for that are. But in any case, we know that Praxiteles was the first one famously to break that convention. And we know too that initially it was not widely accepted or praised by everyone. In fact, the sculpture was first offered to Kos, the island just off the coast of what's now Turkey, very close to Knidos, which is on a small peninsula. And Kos, I think the powers that be there were sort of mortified that someone would make such a statue, and they said, no thanks, we'll pass. And he made for them
a bit more conservative.
Yes.
And Knidos got all the tourists for the next centuries.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's another remark in the Q&A, Brittany.
Yes, we have a comment from Michelle Kidwell-Gilbert that there's an interesting contrast of nudity as natural state, whereas male nudity, also termed heroic nudity.
Any of you wish to respond to that?
Except I would say yes, except that's what Praxiteles was trying to change, in my opinion. The formal innovation for Praxiteles was he was making the female nude as heroic as the male nude, in my opinion. But it's just my opinion.
But if we can return to this issue a bit more, Patricia, for women visiting museums, there might be a bit of awkwardness when confronted with naked or half naked statues. How do you feel that women in visiting museums could respond to that confrontation?
Well, I think Professor Rachel Kauser, who is actually a colleague of mine at Brooklyn College, but she is a ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, expert. She says that, the history of the female nude in Western art, like Seth said, begins with Aphrodite. And the big shift is that she is a mature adult, sexual human being that happens to be female. And that part is really important. It's an adult, and that's really different, I think, in a lot of other centuries and geographies. And we have to remember the heroic nude, of powerful male leaders, right, continues, right, as a symbol of power and respect, continues up till Canova doing Napoleon and George Washington, right? So this was always seen as respect. Now, are there, I can't even say thousands, I don't know how many, sexist, misogynistic, images, sculptures are there of female humans throughout the Western canon, for sure. But I don't think Aphrodite's one of them because she was so powerful. She's not in a subservient pose. You can't say what's titillating, what isn't, because everyone's different, but there's a power and a dignity in the calmness of the forms, right? And the posture that I think is a little different. And
but
I
the
think
power
actually,
may then be that women feel more comfortable about their own body.
exactly. I was going to say, in my opinion, ancient art is like a really great place to introduce, I'm not going to say really children to the elderly, like how to have a healthy relationship with your body. Like, I actually think this is true.
Yeah.
I can't say the same for Picasso and a whole bunch of other artists.
I do want to move on a bit because it's 1:45, but Brittany, I see another comment in the chat.
Yes, Sheremy Bundrick, building on that idea, added that when she sends students to TMA to choose objects for visual analysis papers, female students often choose the Aphrodite, and nearly always they speak of body positivity and empowerment.
Exactly. So that confirms our thoughts.
Fantastic.
Thank you for that, Sheremy. So in my talks, I always like to talk about the relevance of ancient art, and the title or part of the title of the exhibition and the forthcoming TMA's publication has this in it, the lure of antiquity. So in a contemporary, even diverse society, from an art historical perspective, we can look at modernism, now 100 years old, when sculptors and painters deliberately rejected the past. In my sense, that is like the entanglement of Laocoon that you see here, trying to not get killed by the snake, but ultimately the entanglement is impossible to loosen. But what is your personal fascination with antiquity?
Well, my personal fascination with antiquity is I'm somebody who's always looking for answers to lots of questions. Questions I have about being a human being today. And, in the last few years, I've been really interested and concerned about democracy, right? And I still am. And it was, like I said, when this invitation from Seth came, it was fantastic to be able to go back to the cradle of democracy and start, I'm not just trying to delve into ancient art. I want to know about ancient history as well, because art doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a historical, real context, political, social, religious, everything. And so, if you're worried or interested in democracy like I am, going back to the cradle was really illuminating. For example, who gets to be a citizen? Who gets to vote? You know, how is the population controlled? I.e., you know, do we need more people or fewer people? And all these things are directed by laws back then and now. And having a longer view of history just makes you feel a little bit calmer and not quite as hysterical, you know, in your day-to-day practice. And there's so much to learn about how to be a human being today if I look back and study the ancient world, especially around these issues. Also, the other thing I was, the other, so democracy was the big thing, but the other big thing was the separation and then subsequent subjugation of the sexes, right? You know, not just when does it begin, because obviously we all know that, but when does it get codified? And when does it get codified into law? And then trying to figure out how we got from then to here, to now, to today. So there's just a lot that, for example, if I had to live back then, I'd want to be in Sparta, definitely not Athens, as a woman, right? So you know what I mean? Like there's so much to learn, and I'm just skimming the top. I just learned so much about today by researching that time.
Yeah, I think, Seth, that you have a couple of examples where you can see how antiquity gives us a perspective simply on humanity.
Yeah, I think for me, what's really fascinating about the ancient world and ancient art in particular is that all of these objects that we look at in the museum were made by real people and they were used by real people. And usually you can't go to the museum and hold it in your hands, but you still have a connection to the people who made and used these things. And I think that's an important reminder, as Patty says, that you can learn a lot about how to be a human today by looking at how people were humans a long, long time ago. And I could have given hundreds and hundreds of examples, but I chose these three vases, the one on the left and in the middle, both in Tampa, and the one on the right in Cleveland. You can see they're all similar in shape. They're what we call alekithos. They're painted in three different techniques: black figure on the left, white ground in the center, and red figure on the right. And if we zoom in on the images, I can talk just really briefly about what they say to me and how they connect us to humans. So starting on the left, I think this is a scene from an artist's imagination, right? These are satyrs and maybe a Maenad and maybe Dionysus. The one on the left is, I think, squashing grapes to create wine. So it's a reference to winemaking, which is something that we still do today. But the way that they're sort of cavorting about, and I would point out in particular the little satyr playing the pipes on the Maenad's head, and you can see the arrow there, right? I think this is a visual joke, right? This was funny to the person who made it and probably to the person who bought it. And it's funny to me still. And I think it's funny to a lot of people who see it at the museum. Then if you look at the one in the center, it's a much, much more serious tone, right? This is telling us, you can see the woman on the right is holding a vase that is exactly the type of vase on which it is painted, right? So this is what people today might say sort of a very meta kind of illustration, right? A self-referential one where we're seeing what these vases were used for. They were perfume vessels that were brought to the tomb. The monument in the center is the tomb. And just like if you go to a cemetery today, you see people offering flowers or pebbles, or coming up, it will be Memorial Day and we'll see American flags, right? This is something that we still do today that they were doing 2,500 years ago to pay respects to the deceased. And then finally, the one on the right here in Cleveland is a solitary warrior. And I made a short video about this about a year ago at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were all spending all of our time all alone. I thought this is something that might speak to people, right? He's alone with his thoughts, apparently before battle, right? He's all dressed up in his armor, his shield and his helmet and his spear are all sitting before him. And he's holding a lock of hair with his sword, right? And scholars have debated whether he's combing his hair, as we hear the Spartans did before battle, or if he's cutting a lock of hair, as we know that the 7 against Thebes did before they went into battle. And that hair would be a memento if he didn't survive, right? So a very somber moment, but also a good illustration of a strong individual in antiquity taking charge of the moment. And that's something I think that we all should try to do today.
Yep, that's great.
So that's your cue, Patricia. But I think there is another comment by Dr. Bob Bianchi again, pointing out that even in male-dominated Athens, women did play a very defining role. And he is thinking particularly of Antigone, who defies conventions, or the revolt by Lysistrata, of course, in a comedy where the women go up in revolt and say, make love, not war.
Mm-hmm.
Still very relevant today. But another relevance of antiquity, Patricia.
Yes, I had a question for, the two experts, the scholars, Branko and Seth, because I've been hearing some artists, obviously, on the left side of the political spectrum, kind of regurgitating some of the white supremacist and white nationalist scripts about this whitewashing and equating white marble with whiteness in terms of race and ethnicity. And I'm dismayed and confused. And I just wonder what you both would have to say about that. I'm really, really curious.
Yeah, there's, of course, no room to give this any depth as it should have. It's a subject that you give, I think, an entire lecture series on, or a seminar. But yeah, it's whitewashing of sculpture, both in the literal and in the figurative sense. I've illustrated here a marble sculpture of Emperor Augustus that when it was found, it still had pigment traces on it that were clear enough for an artist to reconstruct the color. But interestingly, that same artist decided not to paint the skin because they felt that that would be kitsch, I reckon. Debates have now gone through, was his skin painted at all? Was it painted pink, or was it gilded to imply that Augustus was divine? Despite the fact that that pigment was on there, just as in modern days, limbs were added, heads were added, it was felt ugly to have just traces of paint. So it was literally washed off until all the pigment traces were gone. And that started playing into the idea that white is pure and white and beauty are very closely associated in art. I think here this misconception emerged that the white marble is indicating ethnicity. If you've ever been to the Mediterranean, you will know that people do not have milk white skins there. But also, if marble were an indication of skin color, then what are bronzes? Are they indicating that people were lizard people back in antiquity? Bronze is obviously also not an indication of color. And then, Seth, maybe you can explain what is happening here.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite vases to use when this topic comes up, because it's one of the only illustrations that we have from antiquity of a sculpture that's actually being painted. And so what we see here in the center is a sculpture, apparently a marble one. You can see it's mostly white. It's Heracles with his club, and his lion skin is not white, right? It has already been painted. You can see the painter working on it. And at the left is his assistant, presumably, who's heating up the pigments. This was probably wax that needed to be melted before it could be applied to the sculpture. And then what I really love about this is that up above is Zeus on the upper left watching, and then to the right is Heracles himself. So Heracles is seeing this sculpture of himself. Presumably he's happy with it, right? And Nike up above sort of acknowledging it well as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is good. Heracles approves.
Right, and I would just add one thing, that there's this famous story, I think it's from Pliny, where Praxiteles, again, is asked which of his many, many sculptures is his favorite. And he says, well, whichever one has been painted by Nicias, right?
Exactly.
So we know, we have all the evidence. We know that the sculptures were painted.
Mhm.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of today's program. I would like to encourage everyone in the audience to continue patronizing the TMA, to wander around the museum and wonder about the ancient, modern, and contemporary art on display, and always feel connected in your own personal way with the objects. And I thank you all for your attention. If there are any questions, then this is the time to raise them. Brittany, are there any new questions up in the chat?
We have not received any new questions. However, Dr. Bob Bianchi has his hand raised, so I will unmute him.
Bob, how are you today? Bob, are you there still?
It looks like Bob is still muted.
Yeah.
I apologize. That was an error with my mouse.
It's good to hear your voice.
Thank you, Seth. I enjoyed the
Always.
program immensely, and I want to thank all of you for actually presenting it. It was very, very enlightening, very, very informative, and I think very, very topical. So thank all three of you. It was fantastic.
Thanks, Bob. Always good to hear from you. I think the chat is thanking you all, Seth and Patty, for being here. Jeremy, thanks you, and Barbara Bird, thanks us for the presentation. Any other questions in the audience? You can raise your hand or ask to be unmuted. Nothing, Brittany?
I am not seeing any new questions come up. Oh, Bill Zawadzki has raised his hand.
Another friend of the museum, and let me remind everyone that Bill Zawadzki sponsored today's program.
Thank you, Bill, for making it possible.
Well,
Yes.
great to hear you all do a fine program. I wanted to comment about my favorite part of the statue, and that is that the carving beneath her, I think, left arm is so thin that the light can go through it. It's translucent because it's so thin.
Yes. Oh, great. I'm so glad you noticed that. I really wanted her to, have this lightness. We've got the solid gravity of the stone torso and then the cold cast marble torso, but to have this other lightness. And it's really, I'm so glad you noticed it and like that part, because it was a site specific commission, and so I really planned it for that space. And it was really important to me that sometimes she seemed completely whole if she was in shadow with the changing light, and other times seemed more fractured, fragmented for our fractured times. So just like the ancient times were. So I'm really glad you saw that. Thank you.
Excellent. We're getting a few more thanks in from Garson Hertzfield and from our director, Michael Tomor. They extend their thanks. If there's nothing else, guys, I think we can wrap up today's program. Brittany, what are your feelings?
I agree. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon, and a particular thank you to our panelists.
Oh, it was great. Thank you so much. I love the conversation. Great to
Thank
see
you.
Brittany, Seth, and Branko. This was wonderful.
Yeah, let's hope we can do it in person before too long.
Next time in person.
Yeah.
Got just one more note in from Samantha Jones, who thanks Bill and thanks Patricia and Seth for the program and the presentation. She had the opportunity to visit the exhibition, and she cannot overstate how inspirational it was for her own work. So that is always very
That's so
nice.
sweet. Thank you.
Yeah. So with that, I think we can wrap up. And thank you all again for joining us. Yes, let's hope that in-person presentations will become normal again.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.